Okay, well, it's 10:01, so we can go ahead and start. My name's Kathleen. I'm a graduate student in the psychology department, and I will be the session chair for today. So I will kick things off because I want to make sure all our speakers have time to get through their talks and for some questions afterward. So I'm going to be looking at my other screen because that's where I have all my intro information for everybody. Grace Clark is our first speaker. Grace is a senior at UNCG pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. She's a disciplinary honors student in the Lloyd International Honors College and received an Undergraduate Research and Creativity Award scholarship for the fall 2021 semester. Grace's project is titled Examining Interactive Effects of Group Membership and Untrustworthiness on Recognition Memory. So Grace, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Okay.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Grace, and I will be presenting my honors thesis, examining interacting effects of group membership and untrustworthiness on recognition memory. So to begin, I would like you all to consider which person you think you'd be more likely to remember. Would it be the man on the left or the man on the right? And now notice that there's a label underneath each person. Would this change your mind? So in the picture I just showed, one of those people has been categorized as trustworthy and the other has been categorized as untrustworthy. And a growing body of work has found that people remember untrustworthy faces more than trustworthy ones because they could indicate potential danger. And this work has examined recognition memory without using other cues, such as group membership. Recognition memory refers to the ability to remember something that has previously been seen before. Also, the perception of untrustworthiness is believed to be so important for survival that, according to evolutionary theory, people should remember survival-related information better than other types of information. And studies have tried to replicate the experience of quickly and passively viewing faces. And this research has found that people have better recognition memory for untrustworthy versus trustworthy faces. And this finding is consistent with other research suggesting that people are motivated to remember faces that give cues of potential danger that should be avoided. And research has also found that people remember more in-group than out-group faces, and this is called in-group bias. Research by Bernstein et al. Has found that just simply assigning faces to a category caused own group bias among the participants. This is important because it shows that non-pre-existing groups can bring about bias among in-groups and out-groups. And research has found that people rate the emotional expressions of in-groups more positively than out-groups. So by labeling a face with in-group membership, it resulted in a more positive perception. So it seems plausible that untrustworthy in-group faces would be perceived as less untrustworthy than out-group faces. To date, there's very little research on how group membership and facial trustworthiness could interact together to affect recognition memory. And my current research is motivated by the question, how well do people remember trustworthy and untrustworthy faces that are arbitrarily categorized as belonging to an in-group or an out-group? And I established an in-group and out-group in my study by randomly assigning the participants and the stimuli to one of two different personality types, either red or blue, and this personality was arbitrary. So my hypotheses were drawn from the past research I've just discussed. So I hypothesized that people would remember the untrustworthy faces more than trustworthy ones, and that people would remember in-group faces better than out-group. And I hypothesized that trustworthiness and group membership would interact to affect recognition memory. And importantly, that the untrustworthiness advantage in memory would be stronger for the out-group versus the in-group faces. So in other words, the untrustworthy advantage, it would be reduced for the in-group. As for my stimuli, I used 88 neutrally expressive white male faces from the Chicago Face database. And the faces had already been classified as being trustworthy or untrustworthy. Half of them were randomly assigned to have a red personality and the other half to have a blue personality. And as you can see, the faces were all grayscaled and cropped to the face area to limit the chance of distracting participants. My study used a 2x2 within subjects design, which means that participants saw faces across 4 combinations of trustworthiness and group membership. I had a trustworthy in-group, a trustworthy out-group, an untrustworthy in-group, and an untrustworthy out-group. And because the participants were randomly assigned to their personality type, this is what created the in-group and out-group. Participants were recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk, a platform that allows people to recruit online participants for studies. And the study was conducted online. I had 149 participants. They took a 10-question personality test and then were randomly assigned to have a red or blue personality. Then they completed a learning phase where they saw 44 of the faces selected randomly, and the faces were labeled with a red or blue personality. And the participant's job was to indicate which personality type the face belonged to. Afterwards, they completed a quick distraction task that was about 3 minutes long, where they just answered simple math problems. And then they completed the recognition phase of the study. And here they saw all 88 faces. 44 were new and 44 were from the learning phase. And here they indicated whether they'd seen the face before or whether it was new. So the graph on the left shows the expected measure of recognition memory, which was measured using D prime. And D prime, what that means is that the larger the value, the more accurate the participants were with their responses. And the blue bars represent trustworthiness and the red bars represent untrustworthiness. So as you can see, I expected the D prime level to be very similar across the in-group measures because I expected the untrustworthy advantage to be reduced for the in-group. And for the out-group, it shows that the untrustworthy out-group was expected to be remembered more. But the graph on the right shows the actual results of the study. And if you look at the in-group bars, you can see that there was actually not a reduction in the untrustworthy advantage. And for the out-group, the untrustworthy faces were remembered more than the trustworthy ones. The analysis used to analyze the results was a 2-way repeated measures ANOVA, and the ANOVA found no significant effects for group membership, for trustworthiness, or for an interaction between trustworthiness and group membership. However, I did find that the untrustworthy advantage was maintained, but this finding was marginal. So as I mentioned before, I predicted that facial trustworthiness and group membership would interact and that the untrustworthy advantage would be reduced for the in-group. Overall, the results are not in line with my hypotheses, And they show that the untrustworthiness advantage was maintained, although the effect was quite small. And the results did not find a group membership effect, which is not in line with past research or with my hypothesis. I think that this could be because trustworthiness is a more powerful cue than group membership. But another possibility is that the personality test I used didn't elicit sufficient group manipulation. So one way that I would like to mitigate this possibility in the future is to ask participants to write down their personality type or to verbally communicate it to the researcher in order to increase the salience of the personality test. And no interaction was found for the reduced untrustworthy advantage, which indicates that group membership may not have a significant influence on trustworthiness. So therefore, these cues may be more salient than group membership cues when they're presented together, which actually counters the hypotheses of my study. The most significant limitations was the participant exclusion, which ended up reducing the number from 149 to 58. And that's quite significant. So it limited the statistical power of my study. And another limitation was the format. It was conducted online, and this probably contributed to the high participant exclusion. If I were to conduct this study in a lab setting rather than online, I think that the participants would be less distracted, and therefore it could increase the accuracy of the responses. Another limitation I think worth mentioning is the use of the white male faces as stimuli. However, it was necessary to use these stimuli in order to control for variables like gender or race that otherwise could have impacted the results. And this study looked at how recognition memory affects group membership and trustworthiness, but it didn't examine gender or race. So it's unclear how the findings could generalize across female minority faces. Also, the current research used an arbitrary group membership, but using group membership cues like race or political affiliation, it could lead to more salient in-group bias because these groups are associated with stereotypes, while the arbitrary personality type that I used in my study is not. So future research should investigate how facial characteristics like likability or dominance affect recognition memory when they're presented with group membership. And this is important because the perception of these characteristics is crucial during social interaction. So overall, my research takes an important first step in investigating how more than one characteristic affects recognition memory. And I hope that psychological research continues to value research that examines how people behave in a more realistic way, because people don't live in a vacuum. So we need to consider how complex our social environments are. And this includes how people are categorized. So my research sought to emulate this real world process. I would just like to extend my gratitude to everyone for their time, and I'd like to thank my thesis advisor, Dr. Cassidy, for all of her help, as well as Dr. Baziowski for helping me come up with my proposal. So thank you very much.
Awesome, that was great, Grace. I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you used like red personality and blue personality in your study, and I'm wondering, like, do you think that those labels, since red and blue are like connected to political parties in the US, like, do you think that like maybe that like, I don't know, like people associated it with that maybe, and maybe that caused like some like weird confusion? I don't know.
That's a really interesting question. I actually haven't considered how the color context could have impacted the results, but I think that in the future, when or if I'm able to replicate the study, I'm going to put a lot of thought into exactly what the participants are seeing in terms of the label and how that could impact the results. Mm-hmm. It could be that they do pay attention more to the label, and maybe they aren't paying attention to the actual face as much. So yeah, I think that future research should examine how the color context could be impacting the results. So yeah, I think it's possible.
Awesome, thanks. All right, any other questions? Okay, well, we will move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Caroline Malloy. Caroline is a UNCG senior majoring in psychology, and she's also a 2021 Spartan of Promise. Her interests include group membership, facial evaluation, and women's leadership. As a disciplinary honors student in the Lloyd International Honors College and McNair Scholar, Caroline has presented her research at the 2021 North Carolina Honors Association Annual Conference and has recently been awarded the Undergraduate Diversity Registration Award to present at the 2022 Society for Social and Personality Psychology Convention in San Francisco, California. Caroline's project is titled Examining Group Membership Effects on the Positive Relationship Between Facial Trustworthiness and Likability.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Kathleen. First and foremost, my apologies if my audio lags or if my video lags at all. I'm currently at a hotel for a conference, so my Wi-Fi isn't the best right now, but thank you all so much for joining this morning. I hope wherever you're at currently, it is really nice. And I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I just spilled the beans for something I want to show you guys. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, I think we are ready to go. So first and foremost, can you guys see two faces? Great. So hi everyone. I want to start by asking you, which of these two faces do you consider to be more likable? And you don't have to verbalize this. I just want you to take a few seconds, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, to look at these faces and to determine for yourself which you think is more likable. Okay. Now, which of these two faces would you consider to be more likable? And I would also like you to consider, did your initial reaction or your initial impression, did that change at all? And why do you think that might be? Do you think it's associated all to those labels that I applied to the top of the faces? If so, you hit the head on the nail, because that's exactly what I studied. How does political affiliation, when it's applied to faces, how does that affect the positive relationship between facial trustworthiness and basically our resulting evaluations of likability of those faces? So first, I'm going to tell you all a little bit about facial trustworthiness and its relationship to likability evaluations. So when making first impressions, we automatically evaluate faces for how trustworthy they appear, because it tells us if we should approach or avoid a person. So it's very much an innate tendency that we have to protect ourselves and to keep ourselves safe, right? In fact, a highly trustworthy face highly trustworthy faces are evaluated to be highly likable, and those that aren't so trustworthy are considered to be highly unlikable. For example, defendants who appear more trustworthy in court cases actually even receive more lenient sentences because they're considered more likable or more likely to have some other redeeming qualities, right? So there's definitely a positive relationship between facial trustworthiness and likability. But one thing I do speculate is that group membership might affect this relationship. Oops, I'm sorry, it looks like I accidentally slipped this guide. Okay, so group membership. So for example, things like race or political affiliation gives us all a sense of self, right? It helps us to determine who we are and who we fit with and who we might not fit so well with. So it really, really fuels our sense of self. And it can lead to things, unfortunately, like bias and prejudice. But concerning facial evaluations, Lazarus et al. Actually found that people thought the fearful faces of in-group members were more positive or more likable than the happy faces of out-group members. Also, there's another study that found that people perceive trustworthy faces to be in-group members, and they perceive untrustworthy faces to be out-group members. And mind you, they've never seen these faces before in their lives, don't know these people whatsoever, but they made those initial judgments strictly because of how trustworthy or untrustworthy they appeared to be. So moving on to political affiliation. Political affiliation is one of the most salient forms of group membership there is. In fact, some research shows that it might be more salient than race or even gender. So it's not surprising, I'm sure, that it leads to in-group favoritism or dislike towards opposing groups. And actually, dislike and derogation towards opposing political affiliation members is actually more normal or more acceptable than it would be in the case of derogation or bias on the basis of race or gender. So important to this study, Iyengar and Westwood in 2015 actually found that random faces were later evaluated to be more likable after the participant discovered they shared the same affiliation. So, for example, when they first evaluated these faces, they didn't really like them. But then when they showed those faces a second time around, they're like, oh yeah, we really like them. And that was simply because they shared that they had the same affiliation as the rater. Okay, so my current study, as I've shared before, due to the importance of group membership to our sense of identity and this really interesting relationship, I wondered, how does political affiliation affect this positive relationship that I described earlier between facial trustworthiness and likability? That's exactly what I studied. So to answer my question, I came up with two hypotheses. With the first being that in-group partisanship would strengthen the relationship so that likability evaluations would be higher, regardless of trustworthiness, and that out-group partisanship would make likability evaluations lower. My second hypothesis is that I predicted that very trustworthy in-group faces would have an additive effect on evaluations, such that faces that were likable and in-group would be literally extremely likable, basically on a whole different scale of likability, so extreme likability. So to support these hypotheses, I created a Qualtric survey using white male faces. I used 90 or so white faces, and they were all white, and they all range from very trustworthy or very untrustworthy. And I pulled these faces from the Chicago Face Database, which created faces that were rated by, I believe, 100 or more participants on how how trustworthy or untrustworthy they appeared to be. And that's what I used for my stimuli. But I applied to those faces Republican, Democrat, or no information labels. And I asked participants to rate on a scale from 1 to 7, how likable did they perceive these faces to be? So for my analysis, to analyze my data after I collected all my really interesting findings, I ran a model entering facial trustworthiness, group information, and political ideology, and all of their interactions as fixed effects. And the reason why I chose to do that is because, kind of with the nature of the study, there's so many things that could have been extraneous variables, but I didn't want those things. I wanted to bypass that. So I made a module where the only thing that would pop up for me as an effect, or the only thing that could potentially be measured, would be those 3 primary things. And then the things that could pop up that I wanted to measure would be, of course, the participants in their face and how they identified the faces, because that could vary, but that was something I want to look into. So that's what I used. But in support of my first hypothesis, I found that very conservative and very liberal participants evaluated the in-group members to be more likable than out-group members, which is definitely what I predicted. And you can actually see this depicted in the little graph sections here that is outlined in teal. So for example, in the very conservative graph, the Republican line is above the non-line, and the non-line is above the Democrat line. And that just tells us that conservatives favor in-group members more over out-group members, and even more so than non-information faces. But in support of my second hypothesis, there was an interaction between my IVs that provided us with a stronger or weaker positive relationship, such that in-group partisanship strengthened it and out-group partisanship weakened it. But concerning conservatives, people who were very conservatives in general found faces of their parties to be way higher in likability than moderate conservatives. But we didn't see this for the Democrats or the no information faces in regards to Democrat participants. And one thing that's really fascinating that kind of goes against the grain of current literature is that, as you guys can see I think, very well depicted in the very liberal section. Democrats in general tended to derogate and tended to have a lot more favoritism than Republicans and conservatives did for their in-group members. So when it came to derogation and just in general disliking faces just because they're not of the same group, we saw that a lot more with Democrats than we did with conservatives. And existing literature on how Republicans have more of a propensity to derogate. I'm sorry, I'm getting so tongue-tied. We figured we would find this effect with conservatives or Republicans, but nope, we found it with Democrats. So that's a really interesting finding. But overall, our findings definitely suggest that group membership is a cue that affects spatial evaluations and not just the structure of the face itself or the appearance of the face itself. There's other things, other contextual cues like group membership that definitely affects those first impressions that we make. And I also really speculate that our findings suggest that the additive effect we found is due to in-group inclusion and maybe even group reputation tendencies that people have that suggest we more or less evaluate highly trustworthy in-group faces to be extremely likable because, we figure in-group membership alludes to them having positive traits, right? Because if they're like me and I'm a good person, then they have to be great too. I think many times we do have those assumptions of people. We assume they're going to be really awesome because they're like us. But when it comes to the limitations of my study and future directions, I definitely understand that using white male faces and political affiliation does limit my generalizability. But an explanation for why I use white male faces is because I was really interested in establishing just one form of group membership and how that affects the relationship. If I had incorporated faces, for example, if I had incorporated Black faces in addition to the white faces, then I would have probably, intentionally or unintentionally, I would have been studying race as well. And that's not exactly what I want to do, because in order to establish that this relationship can even be affected, I thought it would be best to start with just one form of group membership, and political affiliation, as I said before, is actually more salient in more cases than race. So I decided it would be best to go with political affiliation. But yes, also another thing that I would like to do as far as future directions go, in the future, I would hope to see whether or not this relationship is affected by an arbitrary group. So political affiliation, definitely not arbitrary. It definitely has a lot of meaning and purpose to people. In some cases, it has a really big effect on our everyday lives. But I would love to see in the future, how would an arbitrary group, for example, kind of the segments that Grace used, blue team, red team, how would that affect? Would people still feel, if I assigned a participant to the red team and then I showed them red faces, would they feel some type of sway or some type of pull to that face? That's one thing I'd like to see. Is it just salient groups that affect this relationship, or is it arbitrary groups also? But that actually concludes my presentation. And I would just like to thank Dr. Brittany Cassidy and Dr. Colleen Hughes for their support throughout this project. I would like to thank the McNair Scholars team, so Melody Rude and everyone else at the McNair program that has been very helpful. Dr. Janet Boziowski for her support and guidance as I created my proposal for this project, and ERSCO for them funding this project and giving me the opportunity to be here with you all today. I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you all so much for listening.
That was great. Thanks, Caroline. I have one question. I think the finding with the Democrat group is super interesting, like how they were, I guess, disliked, more opposite affiliation, more so. I'm just thinking so many things about this. So I know right now in our country, our politics are super inflammatory. Do you think that you would find that same thing 15 years ago or something like that? A time when it was maybe less so? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about that exact question a lot lately. Okay, number one, why did we see that effect with just Democrats? Considering there's this really extensive body of literature that would suggest that we would see this primarily with conservatives and Republicans. I think 15 years from now, if we as a country can continue to go towards more liberal ideology, most definitely. I think one of the reasons why Democrats might have had more derogation in this case is because I think more with liberals, as of now, there's a lot of moralization when it comes to political ideology, right? Automatically, in some cases, if you're on the opposing team, you're a horrible person. And then that leads to, of course, derogation, bias, prejudice, all sorts of things. So I think if we continue on this path of more liberal ideology and ideals, I most definitely think we will see probably more derogation from Democrats within 10 to 15 years. Yeah, thank you for that question. That was great.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great answer. Yeah, so interesting.
I have a question as well. So what, can you hear me? Okay, great. I was wondering, oh my God, no, I swear I did. Hold on. Oh my gosh. Oh no, yeah. So was your research consistent with like other bodies of work with Democrats being more having more derogation? Is that because I know I expected, conservatives to have more of a bias against outgroups, I think. So was your research different? Like yours specifically, did it have a different finding?
Yeah, so I think that's what was really surprising about my research. So my hypotheses were supported. I think it's really innate a little bit, or not innate, but it's intuitive. I think that, of course, people would like in-group faces more, right? I think that's kind of intuitive. But one thing I didn't expect to find, and this is largely because, kind of as you mentioned before, with existing literature, in my case, with the readings that I saw, it was typically conservatives that derogated more. So the fact that I found Democrats derogated a lot more and made this really distinct kind of definition between those forms of group membership, that was really abnormal. I did not expect to find that at all. And actually from my follow-up study, instead of incorporating kind of Black faces, I've actually decided I really want to hone in on the Democrats and see why exactly are they derogating more. So from my follow-up study, I'm going to be studying exactly more specifically around perceived threat, because me and my mentor, we speculate that Democrats in this case might have derogated more because they feel more likely that Republicans are threatening than Republicans feel that Democrats are threatening. So that might be why they derogated so much, because they're scared and they're frightened of them, or they feel like they're taking their resources. So that might be why. But yeah, that was an abnormal finding.
All right, any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thanks, Caroline, so much. So we will go ahead and move to our next speaker. So Kayla is our next speaker. Kayla Miller is a senior honors student attending Pfeiffer University. She's majoring in psychology, criminal justice, and counseling and human services, in addition to having 3 minors in biology, sociology, and national defense. After completing her senior year, Kayla will pursue a PhD in neuropsychology. And Kayla's project is titled The True Meaning of Love, an evaluation of different connotations of the word love. So Kayla, take it away.
Thank you very much. Just a minute to share my screen. There we go. Okay. So the true meaning of love is me and my mentor, Dr. Don Poe. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today, but he's here with us in spirit. So let's look at language. Language is an imperative aspect of our everyday interaction with other people. So language facilitates many things, beginning as behaviors. So if you want someone to do something, you can tell them. If you are expecting something of someone else, you can tell them. Being able to speak with one another and agree on a behavior that needs to next happen, is how most of the world gets done. So at one point we didn't have language, but as the world evolved, we've come up with many different languages. And you'll see even in discussing with other people of another language, it differs in process of understanding, doing hand signals, just trying to make sure that they can understand what you're trying to say. It makes it a lot difficult, whereas language facilitates this. Language facilitates relationships. So understanding one another from another person's perspective, it allows you to form a deeper bond with that individual, being able to see that your experience in life is not exactly the same. So how they're experiencing is different from how you're experiencing. And you can be able to have that conversation and go through life knowing that it's not all about you. Even though sometimes we like to think that we're the main character in the story, there are many different other characters that are at play. And that forms deep bonds, deep relationships that carry us throughout the rest of our life. And also attributions. So looking at this through an attribution theory aspect is that language helps us to assign attributes to individuals, meaning you can either internalize something or externalize something. So for instance, if I'm having a friend and they're having a really bad day, maybe they failed a test and they're being really mean. Okay, well, I can say they have a bad test, so that's why they're acting mean, is because of this one behavior. However, if I meet someone and I don't know why they're being mean, and they can't explain to me why they're being mean, then I may just internalize that and just say, you know what, they're just a mean person in general. And everything that they do is going to be mean, which forms stereotypes. So being able to use language to say exactly what's going on, it affects how we attribute what's going on in everyday life to that individual. So let's look at how words are defined. From the very beginning, when we were born, we are taking in words constantly. So starting at 2 years old, we are starting to understand words and to get words, but we're not quite able to string them together. So we have all these words and we're throwing them out, and it's formulating sentences the older we get. From those words, there are two different ways that they are defined: denotations and connotations. Denotations is the dictionary definition of the word. So this has been gone through scholars for many years. They've evolution throughout the different words that have changed to mean different things. And eventually it gets what we now have this in the dictionary. Connotations are a little bit more subjective, to whereas it's the feeling that's associated with the word. So for instance, way back in the 19th century, awesome and awful had different meanings than they mean now. So awesome used to mean being awful. Is a negative word. Awful meant being good, and it was great, being held to a high standard. However, over the years, as time changed, there became different connotations on those words, and they started switching. And where we get to now, the denotation of the word has completely changed based on the connotation that has followed throughout the years. So without the research, we would have no idea that awful was actually a good thing. And that you're able to describe something as awful was a beneficial word. So abstract words, however, they're more entangled with connotations and with emotions. So as we're growing up, as I said, 2 years old, you're starting to understand words. Well, when you get to be about 5 to 7 range is whenever you start taking in abstract words. Abstract words are things like hope or love. They're things that you can't hold in your hand or you can't see. It's one of those things where you kind of have to come to understand it with experience. So I can tell you the definition of hope that's in the dictionary. However, you don't really get a true understanding of that word until you're able to experience things and being able to put your emotions with hope. So abstract words, there's a lot of research saying that they are entangled with emotions and experiences. So whereas the word love, which is what we're going to talk about, is a dictionary word that you can look up, it means so many different things to other people, and understanding those dictionary definitions helps us to further our communications with other people. So now, how does this contribute to miscommunications? We use words every single day. And being able to talk to each other, we hope that we mean the same thing. If I'm having a conversation with you, I hope that you're understanding exactly what I'm meaning to say. However, if we have different definitions of the same word, then it's like we're talking in completely different languages. And that relationship that we thought we were building is really built on sand, and it just crumbles whenever we realize we're not even speaking the same language. So some of this is assumptions and false beliefs. Like I said, as most of people, we assume that everyone else sees the world like we do. I mean, as far as we know, we're all seeing different colors. We have no idea. You have to walk in someone else's shoes to be able to really understand that, and that's not something we can biologically do. So we have that assumption and that false belief that everyone's understanding what we're trying to say. Also, we have self-serving bias. So if we're looking at miscommunications, if I say something that's correct or that I feel like we're understanding, I internalize that and I say, you know what, I did that very well, or I was able to communicate that effectively. However, when there's miscommunications, it's, hold on, why didn't you understand me? I don't understand why there's a disconnect here. And that self-serving bias, it leads to further arguments and tends to lead to breakups. Looking at previous studies, there is a plethora of information starting from what is love, but there is very little discussing the definition of love and how love is communicated within people as an abstract concept. So starting with Freud's psychosexual stages, he said that love was simply a biological concept that you get from a physical need of sex. And that's come a long way to where we are today, which is the latest research, which is Fair's phototype hypothesis, saying that abstract concepts such as love they're defined by a prototype, or like the most common thing that you understand whenever it comes to a phrase. So if you're saying in love, maybe it's your parents' relationship. You're saying hope, maybe it's hoping to get into a school. It's whatever experience is most prevalent to you. And that's how you relate to the word. And all these studies have come together to still leave us with the question is, how is love defined in different people's minds? And how can we recognize this to stop with miscommunications? Now, to figure out this problem that we seem to be having, I use George Miller's word associations experiment also to kind of combine the two theories to come up with different definitions. So George Miller, he did a lot of work with word associations related to nouns, whereas he would say desk and then expect the first word that comes to mind and would record it into many different categories. So he had categories such as opposites, synonyms and similars, such as if I say dark, the opposite would be light, or if I said dark, you may say night, and the different categories that they broke up. And he took those associations and he says that the associations you come up with are reinforced by the environment you're in. So wherever you are, wherever you grow up, what you're surrounded with, that reinforces that first word that comes to mind. And so taking that concept, I changed his idea from using that for noun words to abstract concepts such as love. So this study was more of an exploratory study, whereas I don't have an exact hypothesis if I expected there to be 100 different definitions of the word love. It was just trying to see with the different demographics, how many different definitions can we come up with? How many different associations were there just within the small sample size? And if you take that sample size and you project it onto the large scale, there must be so many more that are out there that we don't know yet. With my participants, it was an electronic survey that I sent out, along with a consent and confidentiality form that they had to sign before getting to the survey. And I had 144 participants, 106 being females and 37 being males. This was also spread across different age groups. So most being undergraduate students, that was about 87 undergraduate students, the rest being adults, faculty, staff, outside parents and families, relationships, but mostly all associated with Pfeiffer University. With my results, I had 144 total responses from different participants, and there were 630 total words. And out of those 630 words, there were 204 different words. Now, with my survey, I asked them to list the 5 most closely associated words they thought of when they thought of the word love. Listed in order. So the first word I found to be very important, and we'll talk about that later. The first word that they came up with is the word that was most closely reinforced by their environment. And then the other 4 were taken into consideration, whereas how does it relate? Using other words may help us to get a bigger picture of their idea of the word love and the different categories that we created. So out of the 630 total words, there were a lot of repeats, which is important in looking at demographic questions such as age, gender, and whether or not the individual is in a relationship. If you consider if they're in a newly relationship, well, they still be maybe in the honeymoon periods where love is all good and happy. Whereas if they just got through a breakup, things may not be as be as intense as they were before. And from these words, I used grounded theory to came up with 9 different categories. So grounded theory is a process of taking in the data first and then coming up with your methods of how you're going to categorize the groups. So once I got all of my words, I separated them into categories to be able to further examine them. And the categories are listed in order going from left to right. So qualities, actions, extra, emotions, and so forth. These were how much was in each category. So qualities was the biggest category we came up with. An example being commitment. What's a quality of the relationship is commitment. Going into actions such as verbs, hugs, saying different things. The extra category was kind of a large category of random words that were thrown in there. We have hearts, we have someone put beach, they love the beach. So as expected, there are going to be many individualized words where they weren't repeated. Then we have emotions associated with it. Happiness was actually the most used word out of all of the words that were used. People include family, friends, certain names, significant others, so forth. Going into things of time, religion was a category that surprised me. It was actually a relatively large category for different types of religions: God, agape, love, Christianity, moving into Hinduism. So all these different types of religions was not something I had expected. And then going into types of relationships, and then a very small category of marriage, of till death do us part, saying vows and such forth. But interestingly enough, the responses for marriage, none of them were married. They were all single undergraduate students who listed things about marriage. So taking these results, first of all, the first word associations was the most important of all of them, because that was the first word that they thought of coming up with love, and that's more closely associated with their definition. So when you come up with the word love, what's the first thing you think of? The biggest definition was happiness. So happiness is the first thing that they came up with. However, skipping down a little to negative and positive connotations, not all of the connotations were considered positive. We had over 20 different connotations that were negative. Things like bitter, heartbreak, disappointment. So if you're trying to discuss someone in just a small sample size, you're discussing with someone positive connotations of love and happiness. Well, maybe you're speaking to someone who hears love and thinks disappointment. And you're going to have a miscommunication if you're thinking different things. That word love carries so much weight, and whereas someone is them being on cloud 9, and to someone else is their deepest and darkest moment. And noticeably, there are the ambiguity of word responses. So whereas I'll use commitment as an example. Commitment was an example that I use as qualities. However, if you think of commitment, it may also be an action, depending on the way that the word is interpreted. And so since I couldn't further investigate this and be able to talk to the individual who used it, I didn't know the exact definition of the word that they were trying to use it as. But I use inter-rater reliability, me and several other members, to be able to categorize these words. And however we all categorized it in, that was the agreed upon grouping, rather than it just being me looking at the words and what I expected. It's important to acknowledge the abstract definition gap. So if we are able to have awareness of this, then we can say, all right, if there's a definition gap, then we understand this, and let's sit down and actually talk about this, especially when it's in a concept such as important as love. If you're going to get into relationships and breakups, you need to be able to understand what you're getting into. So having just a simple conversation about definitions and how your experience is different from my experience may lead to longer lasting relationships. And lastly, I just want to mention some of the limitations, being that most of the responses were from Pfeiffer University. Pfeiffer University is a small campus. So in order to get a more generalizable response, you would need to open that sample size and being able to talk to other people who may have different ideas about love, especially considering cultural things, gender. There was a gender gap, much more females answered than males. So being able to understand also why there were less males taking the survey to begin with. If it was all a voluntary study and there were equal amount of females and males who could have taken it, what was the difference? So being able to take these into future studies and being able to understand other words. So love is not the only abstract concept, and I'm sure this happens with many other words that we could discuss. So thank you this is my conclusion of my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Great, thanks, Kayla. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, I see some hands. Chloe, go ahead.
Hi. What was the most interesting finding, like most surprising finding that you found from this? Like what excited you the most?
Probably the negative connotations, because I miscommunications, and it's expected, but if you have two vastly different ideas of what love is, such as bitter heartbreak and happiness, having communication between a relationship and a significant other, that decreases your chance of that relationship surviving significantly. So with, now you have more breakups than ever, and as the literature is continuing just showing that relationships are not lasting as long, divorce rates are higher. So taking this into consideration, as maybe miscommunications are an explanation for this, of the different connotations, and awareness hopefully will lessen that effect.
So you would say you think that like communication is the biggest reason, like we don't, maybe that there's a gap in understanding, like the abstract, maybe I think communication is like definitely the reason, like especially after like looking at the research you provided.
Right. And communication is so important, but understanding communication is even more important. So if you say, hey, we're going to communicate, well, that's great, but what are the words that we're using to communicate? Do they mean the same thing? Yeah. Otherwise, we're just chasing our tails going in circles.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Great job, everybody. That was such a great session. Any last questions or anything? Y'all did so great. I'm so impressed by like the rigor of all your projects. It's really, really awesome. All right. Well, awesome. I think we can end the session since we're about out of time. So great job, everybody, and good luck with everything in the future.